Patriots Training Camp is back, and with it, daily editions of the Sports Hub Patriots podcast. Welcome in. I'm Alex Barth, coming to you after day one of 2023 Patriots Training Camp down in Foxborough Gillette Stadium. And joining us for the first episode of the season, the voice of the New England Patriots, Bob Socci. Bob, I think you were the last guest I had in minicamp too, so nice to be able to get back in touch with you here and talk some Patriots football once again.
Absolutely, Alex. Nice to pick up where we left off, get you off the golf course for a little while these next few weeks. Just great to be back out there. And I thought a good crowd today, too, for a midweek opening of training camp. I think we'll see the crowds pick up over the weekend, of course. Hopefully it won't be too hot for them. But I was impressed by the turnout today, and I thought there was a good energy to the fans. They seemed enthusiastic. So it was a great way to get started, get back out there.
I agree with you. I thought the same thing was actually funny. I did my thing. I show up, I take a picture like, hey, I'm here. Here's what's happening. And one of my friends texted me and he goes, it's sad that there's still spots on the bleachers given what it used to be. And I said, I took this photo an hour and a half before practice. It's like, oh, wow, that's a lot of people for the gates just opening. So it really was. They showed up early. They were engaged. There were a couple of times Juju Smith-Schuster and Kendrick Bourne were kind of having fun with them, getting them going. And I thought there was good energy on the field as well. And I guess let's start there. Last year, training camp was kind of where everything started, where we saw the signs of what that season was going to be. And it's just one practice now. We've got a long way to go, but it felt, this goes back to something we saw in the spring, but I think to see it now with the full team in this setting, it felt much more controlled. And just, I feel like there's a confidence radiating from the team that maybe they lost at points last year.
I would agree. And I think the confidence comes from a purpose. It seems like there is a purpose for what they're doing. And I know that sounds outlandish, and on the surface it is, because there's a purpose to everything Bill Belichick does as a football coach. And in particular, the way that he designs practices and coaches his team and teaches. But I think it's clear that there's a difference between the Pats of 2023 and what we saw, as you alluded to, all last summer, and carried over through the fall and into the winter. In terms of what's behind what they're doing. And offensively, they started in the low red zone. Obviously, the defense had the upper hand early. But to me, I just, again, like the rhythm at the pace of getting the plays off on time, getting the ball snapped, not seeing balls on the ground too much unless there were passes broken up. Or overthrows, as opposed to last year. It seemed like there were times when plays got stopped in their tracks, and maybe this is revisionist history, but the ball was on the ground because the quarterback was spiking it in the turf, displeased with what wasn't happening that was supposed to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. There was only one time today I noticed that practice had to kind of stop for a call, and that was Trace McSorley in red zone 7-on-7s, and that's your third string quarterback. He just got here. If that happens once in the course of the practice, that's a pretty good day. And that order to everything, the energy, the rhythm, personally, I felt like Bill O'Brien was a big part of that. After practice, Mac Jones called him a guy you can lean on. I thought that was saying a lot, and just I got to kind of be up right on the sideline for part of practice near where the offense was, and there was no hesitations. There were no questions. Bill O'Brien was very much in charge. You could see the play ends. Everybody looks to him. Boom, definitive. This is the call. This is what we're doing. Right back to it. No wasted time, no wasted energy, no wasted motion. And he does seem to be, hearing Max say that after practice, the guy you can lean on. He does seem to be a guy that players don't really have a problem going to and looking to for information, for help, for whatever it may be. And I think we're seeing some of that too with Adrian Clem, just in the way some of the offensive linemen have spoken about him.
Yeah, a couple of observations regarding that. Adrian Clem at one point was standing behind the offense with David Andrews right next to him. It was while Trace McSorley was out there with that third team unit. And I thought that was an interesting sign, because here's David, the most experienced of the offensive linemen, the captain of that offensive line, now back for his 9th season, talking to Adrian Clem and sharing some ideas, because David was asked about working with Adrian Clem yesterday. And there's been so much instability on the offensive line in that coach's room with regards to changing from Dante Scarnecchia and his long tenure to Cole Popovich and Carmen Brasil, then Popovich being moved out. And then, of course, Billy Yates joining Matt Patricia and kind of changing course during the 2022 season, and now Clem comes in. It's just good to see them on the same page. And to borrow another word from Mac Jones today, he talked about trust. And I think that it goes for the offensive line too, not just the quarterback and the play calling with Bill O'Brien, but for that offensive line too, to know that they can trust in a guy who's been there in the trenches as a Patriot and NFL offensive lineman, who played under Dante Scarnecchia, who's coached at this level and has coached his players hard at this level as well as the top level of college football. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting snapshot from today. And one other soundbite that I thought was especially revealing was perhaps a Freudian slip by Kyle Duggar. Someone asked him about the offense. Andrew Callahan, I think, from the Boston Herald, asked Kyle about the offense in the red zone, if there were some new wrinkles. And Duggar started to say play calling and then kind of caught himself and more or less essentially said he's excited about what the offense he's seen thus far is doing, and really goes back to that purpose, the conception of it, what they're trying to accomplish out there.
And Kyle Duggar obviously did have the play of the day, too, in the red zone working against the offense. The first play of team drills, Mac throws the pick, which I'm not going to read too much into it. He threw one pick over the course of a practice. It happens, but it was like after everything that happened last year, all right, first play, interception. But there was, I thought, a lot made about the quarterback performances today. Mac Jones was 5 of 10 with the interception. Bailey Zappi was 4 of 11, multiple passes batted down. He was 0 for 4 in 11s. Trace McSorley was 3 of 10. I do think it is important to sort of qualify what that all is, to put some context to those numbers. They're working in the low red zone. There's not a ton of room to work. It's very congested. There's no threat of the run in a non-padded practice. So I've kind of seen some people point to this and say, here we go again. I do think there is an element, though, of it's one day. It's a drill that probably favors the defense. If the whole week looks like this, we can start having that conversation. But I thought, going back to his rookie year, I remember the book on Mac was kind of, he would be great at training camp until he made his first mistake. And then when he made his first mistake, that was kind of it. He would never recover throughout the day. Last year, it was all kind of rough. There wasn't a ton of time for him to get going. This year, boom, he comes out, throws a pick. But I thought obviously he got better from there, but I thought the last period was his best. He was throwing with much more command. There was one ball he fit in a tight window. It was to one of the tight ends. I want to say it was to Hunter Henry, but I don't remember.
Hunter Henry, there's a low throw in the back of the end zone, maybe?
Yeah, that he kind of fit through a tight window. That's a confidence throw. You trust yourself to make that throw. So, that's not to excuse entirely the quarterback's poor performance today. They want to be better, and Mac Jones said after practice, it's all about looking at the film. There's things we need to do better, but I thought for what it wasn't the worst possible day they could have had. And it's not like, oh no, the season kind of alarm bells thing.
Well, it's funny though, because when he did throw that first interception, I joked to the person I was sitting next to, oh, here we go.
Right.
Radio gold, especially between the hours of 2 and 6.
Yeah. I could hear the open already
on our station. And the other thing too, Alex, when you watch it, and I know I'm probably more in the Mac Jones camp than the Bailey Zappi camp. I'll admit I am. I think Mac is the front runner clearly at quarterback. And I really don't think Bailey will overtake him unless Mac comes back to Bailey. But there's a difference in those numbers too. One of the things that I wonder about watching today, how Bill O'Brien views, some of the things he saw from the number 2 and number 3 quarterbacks out there, the sidearm flips into congested area of the red zone, the jumping off the back foot, fading away throw to the other far corner of the end zone by Trace McSorley during one of his series. There's some bad habits. And I know we see Patrick Mahomes, do it with regularity, and a few other quarterbacks, alter their arm slots. They go from over the top to, submarine style, like their baseball pitchers, completely overhauling their windup. But I think that when you're a quarterback like Zappi, you've got to come in, and certainly Trace McSorley, and you've got to look like you could be reliable out there in terms of being mechanically sound, making good decisions. And I thought there were a couple of those instances today where it wasn't just, the sidearm improvisational throws that were dangerous, but as you mentioned, balls batted down, the quick turn, and almost like a no look. Throwing toward an area with the ball batted down in the direction of a running back in the flat. So those are things to me that you have to take into account and consider when you start evaluating the quarterbacks, because it goes beyond the numbers and obviously the people they're playing with, people they're playing against. And as you mentioned, in the low red zone, there's very little room with which to operate. I'd be curious what the numbers are for offenses in general in that low red zone area when they're looking to throw.
Yeah, it's an area where you're probably going to pass. Traditionally, the Patriots in games in those spots have passed. They haven't thrown the ball a lot from those situations. Obviously, you want to be good at doing that. It just makes you that much more effective offensively, but it's not easy to do when you lose a lot of room down there. The other interesting thing about them working so heavily in the low red zone, they're not really throwing the ball down the field. We didn't get to see a ton of the wide receivers. I do want to get to the running backs and the tight ends in a second, but I know people want to hear about the wideouts and in this new group with Juju Smith-Schuster and Devontae Parker gets the extension. But, Juju had one play where he caught a touchdown. I thought he did a good job getting himself open against, I believe it was Adrian Phillips early in practice for a score, but didn't see much from them in terms of actual football. I did think it was interesting, though, how frequently they were rotating. I thought that top four group of Parker, Smith-Schuster, Kendrick Bourne, Tyquan Thornton were all getting chances to work with Mac Jones. And I think that's good because the strength in this group, if they're going to move forward with what it is the varied skill sets. They don't have that true number one, but Parker, Bourne, Smith-Schuster, Thornton, they all win different ways. And the way to maximize that is, I think, to get all four of them on the field as much as possible and hunt mismatches. I felt that way last year. They didn't do a ton of that last year. Again, just one practice, an install day, but it was really encouraging to see them kind of mix and match some of those combinations.
And we saw the combinations of the two tight ends out there.
Yeah, and then those guys factor in.
To your point early on as well, and I think it goes back to something we might have said with regards to Kendrick Bourne, the energy and the enthusiasm and the interplay between him and the crowd, and the same thing with Juju Smith-Schuster. I'd like that from Kendrick Bourne. I think that, he's talked about it. He's been honest about last year from a personal standpoint. He was in a doghouse, for lack of a better phrase to come to my mind right now, that he could not escape from. And when he had his opportunities, he made a few plays, but he also made some mistakes that further entrenched him in disfavor, it seemed, with people running the offense. I thought in the spring there was an energy that he had reminiscent of 2021. And I thought it was great to see him today showing that. Now, you got to catch footballs, you got to run routes, you got to win out there on the field. But those are good signs for me. A guy is engaged, a guy is kind of back to a good frame of mind, which he needs to be because he has to be a productive player for this team.
And then the other interesting factor in all this is Ty Montgomery, because I know coming out of spring, we talked a lot about the wide receiver depth and guys were banged up, but after those four, it kind of falls off if you include Ty Montgomery as a running back. But he worked with the receivers today a bit, and he was very involved, led the team in catches, led the team in targets, caught a couple of touchdowns. And again, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this guy because he can play. I don't think it's a question that he can play at a level that can help this team, but he's had trouble staying healthy the last few years, going back before his time in New England. And how much can you build around him? Not build around him, but how much can you put in that requires him to be on the field, knowing that you may not be able to go to those packages or go to those calls because he does have this availability issue. So I'm getting my hopes up again based off what I saw today. I think they'll be up by the end of camp because every time he's on the field, he makes plays. It's just going to be interesting to see kind of how they manage that and how involved he continues to be, given that they don't necessarily, I don't want to say they don't know that they can count on him, but that's kind of what it is. He doesn't stay on the field.
Well, we have the experience of 2022 to tell us.
Right.
He was out there for week one, caught a touchdown pass, but we didn't see him again. I thought it was interesting today. I thought one of the key takeaways was who was out there at running back, and the fact that there wasn't somebody we didn't see in the spring, that it's the guys that were on the roster after they let James Robinson go. Because there'd been some speculation and some reporting that the Patriots were looking around. We know, for example, Leonard Fournette was one of those backs they worked out. They have been mentioned as a team interested potentially in Dalvin Cook. But to see today, Ramondre Stevenson, Pierre Strong, Kevin Harris, J.J. Taylor, and then you mentioned Ty Montgomery. I mean, that's it. They have to feel really good about that group and Pierre Strong if that's what they're going to go into the season with. And perhaps there's plenty of time for them to try to work something out with any of those backs that have been reported of interest to them. But still, that's one of the things that I took away from today. It's just who was out there at that position, considering that back in the spring, I expected them to add to that stable.
I still think they're going to make a move. And I thought it was interesting that Matt Gross said today after practice that they have more workouts scheduled with running backs. They're going to keep working out running backs. And I don't remember if it was a few days before camp or a few days into camp that Lil Jordan Humphrey signed last year. But they'll make moves through the first week or so of camp, pretty much up to, they slow down a little bit, especially now that there's no, first and second cut down date. It's just all at the end. They'll continue to make moves pretty much up until that first preseason game. I wouldn't be surprised if they had another back. And I wonder if they're looking at the group they have right now and kind of figuring out what kind of back do they need. Like, all right, we trust Kevin Harris. We're not so sure on Pierre Strong, so we need to go out and get a change of pace back. Or we like what we're seeing from Strong. We don't like what we're seeing from Harris. Let's go out and get maybe an early down bowling ball kind of back. But you're right. It was surprising when those signings came across on Monday that, all right, here we are, 90 players, no more running backs. And this is the group. I do like, though, within that, this is a team that at times in past years has, for lack of a better term, buried some of their younger players. They've just sort of brought in veterans continuously and not allowed those younger veterans to get a shot to prove whether or not they're good enough, whether they were or weren't. And we're not seeing that right now with Kevin Harris and Pierre Strong. The way things set up right now, those guys are going to have, substantial rotational roles, if not key roles in this offense this season.
And I think there's some things to like about Pierre Strong based on what we saw in the limited sample size last year. I mean, he averaged 10 yards a carry, only 10 carries, but I think he showed some things in the spring in terms of his awareness in the passing game that are encouraging for him, that put him in a good position going into training camp. But you're right. There's plenty of time, particularly when you're talking about some of those veteran running backs. They're not going to be set back really, I think, even though the offense is going to be new to them. In terms of that position and what will be asked of them. They get the pads on next week, as Belichick said the other day. That's when real football begins, real training camp begins. So maybe, they bring somebody in by then, or certainly by the joint practices, or at least the first preseason game against Houston, maybe a week out from that. You want to have somebody around to try to get ready for those games, and especially to be ready for those joint practices at Green Bay and then Tennessee. And, and if I could go to the offensive line, speaking of guys who got a block for the running backs. I mean, obviously there's no pads on, right? But I thought it was great to see Trent Brown out there, and he looked good. Good physically. He looked like the social media posts suggested he might. He looked like a guy. Okay, he got down to the gritty in the offseason after spring OTAs, and he worked hard in the weight room, and he looked like he was in pretty good shape to me.
I wanted to ask you one other thing about the offensive line, too. I was going to ask you about Trent Brown, but what'd you make of Bill Murray starting at right guard? We knew Mike Onwenu was going to be out. He's on PUP. That was previously announced, but, they got Jason Hines, Antonio Maffey. They've drafted a bunch of guys, but it was converted defensive lineman Bill Murray out there, which, by the way, Jim Louth called 2 weeks ago. Jim Louth from the Sports Hub said to me, we were talking, he goes, by the way, I think Bill Murray's going to play a role on offense. And we saw him out there as the starter today. What'd you make of that?
It's funny. I asked a veteran reporter whose opinion I trust a great deal about that very topic, because Bill Murray's a guy that, if you go to the practices, you go to camp, and you go on a regular basis, and you stick around for the post-practice availability, and you can go last year, you can go the year before. Bill Murray is one of the hardest working guys. I mean, I know Belichick has that line, and nobody works harder than that. Well, nobody worked harder than Bill Murray. He and Dietrich Wise in particular, when they're on the defensive side of the ball, rep after rep, against a blocking sled, practice after practice after practice. He's a really bright guy. He's got a great backstory. Last year being asked to move to the offensive line in the midst of practice, in training camp and being able to do well enough, as you mentioned, to start on day one. I use that term loosely. Start on day one, go to that first group.
Right.
That's great. I think maybe it's in part a reward for him. I think he's a veteran, but there's also reason why they drafted 3 guys for the interior of the offensive line. And I think that even, they have some guys that are veterans who could move inside as well and try to shore that up if need be, or move to the guard position as well. Obviously good for Bill Murray. Great to see him out there with that first group today. I'm not sure how long it will continue. I think he potentially could play a role. I mean, stranger things have happened. They had a college wrestler come in and become a mainstay on the offensive line for a while. So why not a guy who was an undrafted player as a defensive lineman? I thought he popped a little bit in the preseason a few years ago in terms of his strength and his motor, his drive. And, he's got a chance to put that to work on the offensive line now.
On the defensive side of the ball, it's tougher in these non-padded practices because defense just inherently is so physical and nobody's hitting anybody. But he had the pick right off the jump, Kyle Duggar, but I thought the whole day he was flying around and he looked excellent. And just being in a contract year, this is generally when the Patriots do those contract extensions. They do them over the summer during camp. And he made a really good first impression. I thought it was interesting when Matt Groh was asked about, not Duggar specifically, but just contract extensions as a whole after practice. And he said, the book's not fully written. It can get tricky because you don't know. There's a whole other year to happen for the guy and for the player and for the team and all of it. But another thing Groh was asked is if he likes players in contract years because it creates that sense of urgency. And Kyle Duggar always plays with his hair on fire. I'm not saying this is why he's doing it, but day one for a guy in a contract year, I thought he popped as much as anybody on defense.
On day one, fielding questions afterwards too about it. Not surprisingly, he said all the right things. He's a guy who doesn't say a lot. I think he gives you good insights and thoughtful answers, but generally he's not wordy, and he certainly wasn't today on that topic. But right frame of mind, as you said, he came out and made a play. He said later that the real key was that he made a mental error that shortly thereafter, and that's the thing you really have to improve upon and learn from. I thought that one of the things, again, defensively in that group that registered with me is the fact that when they were in that low red zone, you had Jabril Peppers and Jalen Mills a lot of times in the middle of the field as the safety there, and Adrian Phillips certainly got a lot of run. But I think that's an area we're going to be watching all training camp and certainly in the preseason. Who's the guy in that back group who's more or less organizing things middle of the field, knowing who's not there this year after so many seasons.
Right. And that's going to be a big one. I'm really interested when they get in a 2-minute drill and that guy has to organize and cover the center field, what that's going to look like. It was also interesting to see, when they split up, we talked about the mixing and matching of receivers. I think there's a lot of mixing and matching on defense as well. And you're seeing some of these position battles start to develop. And, the obvious one's a corner. Right. And we saw a lot of Christian Gonzalez today. We saw a lot of Jonathan Jones today. Jack Jones was on the field, which in itself, I think is notable given what happened in his offseason. And then on the defensive line too, I think there's a lot of guys that you assume are going to get a ton of reps, and they're kind of in and out because they've got a lot of guys they've got to get on the field, and tough without pads, especially without that group up front. Like, I feel like I'm a broken record talking about how it's tough without pads, but it just is. But you see you saw the competition that's kind of building on defense, and there's some good decisions, good place to be, but I think tough decisions coming for the coaching staff.
Yeah, I would agree, Alex. I think there's some guys who've been on this team the last couple of years, and even last year maybe showed some improvement this time of the year and played a fair number of snaps during the regular season, who are going to have to really work and play well, I think, to make the team. I'm thinking of, with Keon White here, for example. I think that his presence and his versatility along that defensive line, there's some guys who've been around the Patriots the last couple of years whose job right now, is there for the taking. And again, you get into the numbers game. It's going to depend on how many safeties they keep. Will, now that McMillan is down, are they just going to replace a linebacker for a linebacker, or is there going to be another position where they add a spot? So does that help somebody up front? I think it's going to be interesting to see, that, as you mentioned, when they get the pads on, what the rotations look like. I'm thinking of a guy like Anthony Jennings, who got off to a really good start last summer and has been around here for a while. Ronnie Perkins has been around here for a while. What's their status for this team going forward? Even on the interior, you've got some guys who've been around for a while who take up a lot of space in there. So I'm very interested in those matchups in the trenches on both sides of the ball, as you mentioned, with the offensive line and the interior, because I think that they really need to build some depth there.
One guy on the interior that played a little less today than I thought, and again, it's one practice, I'm not going to read too much into it, but it's Christian Barmore. And I think we've been waiting. Last year was Christian Barmore going to break out, and then he got hurt early in the season. I think even when he came back, he was maybe a little banged up. And this year now, again, we're picking up kind of where we left off with him last year. Man, if this guy can take that step, what it will do for the pass rush. But is he a guy? I don't think he's going to get cut. Like he should be on the team. I feel like he's, if not a roster lock, as close as you can get, but he's a guy I wonder if, where does his playing time sit? Can he be a 3-down player, or is he going to be more just a pass rusher with some of these other front 7 guys they've brought in?
Well, somebody asked me last night on one of our affiliates up in Maine, for a breakout candidate, or a few of them on both sides of the ball. And I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of hard pressed to think of guys that I really think are poised to take a big jump this year. And I mentioned Barmore because I thought he played well as a rookie, but last year was kind of a step back for him. Didn't flash as much to me. And part of that, too, he got hurt in the Cleveland game. And who knows how much the effects of that injury, played out over the course of the rest of the season. But he's a guy to me that when you go back to his rookie season and some of the things that we saw on occasion from him, he's somebody that really could potentially be a very, very disruptive player defensively. But the key word is potentially. And I'm thinking that this year he's one of those guys that, again, could be a breakout type of player if he's on the field. But he's got to earn those reps, as you mentioned, in the coming weeks during this training camp.
Before we wrap it up and get to kind of what you're looking for tomorrow, I do have to ask you, Bob Socci, the former voice of Navy football, what do you think of Diego Fagot? What do you think of that signing?
I loved him as a player. Yeah, he's a football player. He's a middle linebacker, neck roll kind of guy. Unfortunately, the size for an Navy linebacker and at that level doesn't necessarily translate to playing that position in the NFL. But I think in terms of a guy end of roster, potentially practice squad, maybe somebody that could play on special teams. He was a good special teams player at Navy, blocked some kicks, did some things. Pretty remarkable young man in a lot of ways, having followed him a bit in his college career. Again, just a good influence in the back of the roster in terms of young guys and coming in with a good work ethic and push people and try to do things the right way. Not surprising when he was available that Bill Belichick snapped him up, and because I think that he is someone, like I said, who may not be destined for the roster, but might be a pretty good player to have on the practice squad, particularly with the commitment the Patriots make to special teams. Someone who could help out in that area down the road.
I kind of am penciled into that role too. I think he's a guy, you keep on the practice squad, maybe helps you in the kicking game a little bit, definitely brings that intangible characteristic. And if the Patriots have on their roster, in some sense, Joe Cardona, Diego Fagot, and then, of course, Bill Belichick, Navy can't come here and lose in December. I think they would have the total home field advantage at that point. But as we look ahead here, Bob, we got the wide eyes of the first day of camp, the first day of camp jitters out of the way as we go forward tomorrow and kind of just leading up to the first padded practices, these next few unpadded install teaching practices. What are you looking for?
Well, see tomorrow if they give the offense a little opportunity or more to open it up a bit and see some downfield throws and see some wide receivers get a chance to run long routes and give the crowd an opportunity to roar in excitement at that. I think like these first couple of days, we start looking at lineups, who's starting, who's here, who's there, what's the rotation like. I really don't pay too much attention to that, except for maybe if somebody's at a position where we're not accustomed to seeing them, or perhaps if somebody has left, like a McCourty, okay, who's who's looking to fill that void, or who are they going to audition at that spot? But to me, as you mentioned, I think, they didn't do everything was in a little red zone. We didn't see, Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyquan Thornton, Kendrick Bourne, those receivers get a chance to run downfield. Hopefully tomorrow we'll get a chance to see that. And Mac Jones said it today, got to stack some days. As you mentioned early, he had a good ending to practice after a rough beginning. He's going to look to build on that and continue to strengthen that trust between him and O'Brien. And they've got to be consistent early on, set the tone. So when they get into the padded work, they're ready to go, because last year they were just never ready. And they didn't even do red zone offense in the pads, the goal line offense, right, with the running game we had seen in the past a year ago. And there may be other reasons for it, but I've got to think that part of it was the fact that, they just weren't operating with that zone offense, trying to run, plays with shorts and shells, let alone try to do it with pads at that point.
He is Bob Socci, the voice of the Patriots. You can hear him and read him as well on 98.5 The Sports Hub and 98.5thesportshub.com. Bob, thanks so much for joining us.
Alex, thanks for having me.